The moment Marcus Johnson stepped into courtroom 7B of the Hamilton County Courthouse, he felt small. The 16-year-old tugged nervously at his borrowed suit jacket. His grandmother had insisted he dress properly for his court appearance, so he wore his cousin's old graduation suit. The pants were too short, showing his mismatched socks, and the jacket pulled tight across his shoulders. Marcus had never been in trouble before. He was an honor roll student at Westside High School, where he balanced academics with helping his grandmother at home. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat, often leaving before dawn and returning after Marcus was asleep. The shoplifting charge had happened 3 weeks ago. Marcus had been with some friends at the mall when peer pressure and poor judgment led to him slipping a pair of headphones into his pocket. Security stopped him before he even left the store. Now he stood before Judge William Harrison, a man known throughout the county for his strict sentencing and no-nonsense approach. Case number 2347, Marcus Johnson, called the court clerk. Marcus stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the bench. His public defender, Ms. Rivera, stood beside him. She had met with him for only 15 minutes before the hearing, barely enough time to explain the process. Another shoplifting case. Judge Harrison sighed loudly, looking over his reading glasses at Marcus. The judge was in his 60s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Your Honor, this is Mr. Johnson's first offense, Ms. Rivera began. He's an honor student and— Yes, Judge Harrison interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. I've heard it all before. He turned his attention directly to Marcus. So you think you're smart, do you? An honor student who can't figure out that stealing is wrong? Marcus swallowed hard. No, sir. Yes, sir. I know it's wrong. I made a mistake and— Speak up, boy, and try to use proper English in my courtroom, the judge cut in, his voice sharp. A few chuckles came from the back of the courtroom. Marcus felt his face grow hot with shame. I see boys like you every day, Judge Harrison continued, leaning forward. You think being good at school gives you special privileges. You think the rules don't apply to you? In the gallery, Elaine Carter shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The retired high school principal had come to court that day to support another student but found herself increasingly disturbed by what she was witnessing. Your Honor, Ms. Rivera tried again. Marcus has written a letter of apology to the store. He's willing to do community service and— He can barely dress himself properly for court, Judge Harrison remarked, gesturing to Marcus's ill-fitting suit. Look at him. Pants too short, mismatched socks. This shows a fundamental lack of respect for these proceedings. Marcus stared at the floor, wishing it would open and swallow him whole. He couldn't look up at the packed courtroom, couldn't bear to see the strangers watching his humiliation. What are they teaching at Westside these days? The judge continued, examining the file. Certainly not personal responsibility. Or maybe this is what passes for an honor student there now. Elaine Carter watched Marcus's shoulders slump further with each comment. She had worked in education for over 30 years and recognized a good kid in a bad situation. What she was seeing wasn't justice, it was public shaming of a child who had made a mistake. As the judge continued his verbal assault, something shifted in Elaine. She made a decision that would ultimately change not just Marcus's life, but the entire community's relationship with its justice system. She reached for her notebook and began writing down every word the judge said. No one in that courtroom could have predicted what would happen next because of Elaine's simple act, least of all Judge Harrison himself. Elaine Carter couldn't sleep that night. The image of Marcus standing before Judge Harrison, shoulders hunched and eyes downcast, haunted her. After 32 years as an educator, she had developed a sixth sense about students. Something about Marcus reminded her of countless promising kids she'd seen over the years. Good children who needed just one person to believe in them. The morning after the court hearing, Elaine sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her notebook. She had written down every cruel word Judge Harrison had said. Reading them again in the morning light made her even more disturbed. Judges were supposed to uphold justice, not humiliate children. This isn't right, she whispered to herself, closing the notebook with determination. Elaine dressed carefully that day, choosing her most professional outfit, a navy blue pantsuit she had worn to countless school board meetings. She drove to Westside High School, where she had been principal before retiring 2 years ago. Many of the staff still knew her well. Mrs. Carter, the current principal, David Wong, greeted her warmly when she walked into the main office. "What brings you back to Westside?" "I need to ask you about a student," Elaine said. "Marcus Johnson." Principal Wong's expression changed immediately. "Marcus? Is he okay? He's one of our best students." "I saw him in court yesterday," Elaine explained. "A shoplifting charge. But the way the judge treated him was inexcusable." Principal Wong invited Elaine into his office and closed the door. Over the next hour, he shared what he knew about Marcus, his consistent place on the honor roll despite difficult circumstances, his quiet leadership in class, how he helped tutor younger students in math. "His mother works at the hospital and cleans offices at night," Principal Wong explained. "Marcus practically raises himself and still maintains a 3.8 GPA. This shoplifting thing shocked everyone. It's completely out of character." As Elaine left the school, she felt even more certain that what she had witnessed in court was wrong. She drove straight to the address listed in the school records, arriving at a small but well-kept apartment building on the east side of town. Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Johnson, answered the door. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. When Elaine introduced herself and explained why she had come, Mrs. Johnson invited her inside. The apartment was modest but spotlessly clean. Family photos covered one wall, many showing Marcus at various ages, holding academic awards, dressed for school concerts, and standing proudly next to his mother at what looked like a hospital employee recognition event. "He's a good boy," Mrs. Johnson said, offering Elaine a glass of iced tea. "Never been in any trouble before. That day at the mall, he was with some new friends. Kids he was trying to impress." She shook her head sadly. "One mistake, and that judge talked to him like he was nothing." "Is Marcus here?" Elaine asked gently. "He's in his room. Hasn't come out much since yesterday. That judge broke something in him." Mrs. Johnson's voice cracked slightly. "Marcus has always been so confident, so sure he could make something of himself. Now he's talking about dropping out, saying what's the point if everyone already sees him as a criminal." Elaine felt a surge of anger. This was exactly what she had feared. A right young mind dimmed by the careless cruelty of someone in power. "May I speak with him?" Mrs. Johnson nodded and called for Marcus. When he appeared in the doorway of the living room, Elaine barely recognized him. Gone was the nervous but dignified boy from court. This Marcus looked defeated, his eyes dull and his normally straight posture slumped. "Hello, Marcus," Elaine said, standing to greet him. "My name is Elaine Carter. I was in the courtroom yesterday, and I want you to know something important." She paused, making sure he was listening. "Judge Harrison was wrong about you, and I'm going to help make this right." For the first time since she'd entered the apartment, Elaine saw a tiny spark of hope in the young man's eyes. Over the next week, Elaine Carter developed a simple but powerful plan. After her meeting with Marcus and his grandmother, she had driven straight to the public library to use their computers. There, she researched the process for filing a complaint against a judge in their state. What she discovered troubled her. Complaints against judges rarely led to any real consequences. The system seemed designed to protect its own, but Elaine was not one to back down from a challenge. As a principal, she had faced down angry school boards, demanding parents and budget cuts. This would be no different. "I need to gather evidence," she told herself, printing out the complaint forms. The following morning, Elaine called her former student, Tasha Williams. Tasha had graduated from Westside High 10 years ago and now worked as a reporter for the local paper. They met at a small coffee shop away from the courthouse. "Mrs. Carter, it's so good to see you," Tasha said, giving her former principal a warm hug. "Your message sounded serious. What's going on?" Elaine explained what she had witnessed in Judge Harrison's courtroom, careful not to use Marcus's full name since he was a minor. "This isn't just about one incident," Elaine said, stirring her coffee. "After I saw how he treated this boy, I started asking around. Turns out Judge Harrison has a history of treating certain defendants differently, especially young black men." Tasha took notes rapidly in her small notebook. "This doesn't surprise me. We've received letters about Harrison before, but no one has been willing to go on record. Without that, my editor won't run the story." "I'll go on record," Elaine said firmly. "I have nothing to lose. I'm retired, My children are grown, and I got savings. What's he going to do to me? Tasha looked up from her notebook. Are you sure? Judges have a lot of power in this town. I'm sure, Elaine replied without hesitation. But we need more than just my testimony. We need a pattern. Over the next 3 days, Elaine and Tasha worked together. Tasha pulled court records and transcripts, while Elaine reached out to community leaders, defense attorneys, and former defendants. Slowly, a disturbing picture emerged. Judge Harrison's courtroom behavior showed clear patterns of bias. Black defendants received harsher sentences than white defendants for similar crimes. Young men from poorer neighborhoods were spoken to with contempt, while those from wealthy families were addressed with respect. Meanwhile, Elaine visited Marcus regularly. With her encouragement, he had returned to school after missing 3 days. But the bright, confident student described by his teachers was still hiding underneath a shell of shame and doubt. He keeps saying it doesn't matter if he tries, Mrs. Johnson told Elaine during one visit. Says the world already decided what he is. We're going to change that, Elaine promised. On Wednesday afternoon, Elaine met with Marcus after school. They sat at a picnic table in the park near his apartment building. I want to show you something, she said, pulling out a folder with papers inside. These are stories from other people who appeared in Judge Harrison's court. People who were treated just like you were. Marcus read through the anonymized statements Tasha had collected. His eyes widened as he realized he wasn't alone. There's so many, he said quietly. Yes, Elaine agreed. And that's why what happened to you matters. It's part of something bigger. Marcus looked up at her. What can I do? I'm just a kid. You can heal, and you can grow, Elaine said. The system tried to make you feel small, but you don't have to accept that, and you can help others by letting me tell part of your story. You mean in the newspaper? Marcus asked, looking worried. Will my name be in it? No, Elaine assured him. Your privacy will be protected, but people need to know what's happening in that courtroom. Marcus thought for a long moment before nodding slowly. Okay, you can tell them what happened to me. Maybe it will help somebody else. Later that evening, Elaine sat at her kitchen table with all the evidence they had gathered. She opened her laptop and began typing a formal complaint to the state's Judicial Conduct Commission. At the same time across town, Tasha was finishing her article for the Sunday edition of the paper. Neither woman knew it yet, but they had just lit the fuse on something that would rock the entire county justice system. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. The Hamilton County Gazette hit doorsteps across the city. On the front page of the local section was Tasha's article with the headline, PTTERNS of PREGUDICE, True Billing Behavior in Locale Courtroom. The story didn't name Marcus, referring to him only as a 16-year-old honor student with no prior record. But it described in detail how Judge Harrison had mocked his appearance, speech, and circumstances. The article included quotes from Elaine Carter, identified as a retired school principal with over 30 years of experience in education. What I witnessed wasn't justice, Elaine was quoted saying. It was public humiliation of a child by someone who holds tremendous power. Most powerfully, the article revealed the pattern that Elaine and Tasha had uncovered. Court records showed that Judge Harrison gave sentences that were, on average, 40% longer to black defendants than to white defendants for the same offenses. The disparities were even greater for juvenile cases. By noon, the article was the most read story on the newspaper's website. By evening, it had been shared thousands of times on social media. Local TV stations picked up the story, with reporters stationed outside the courthouse seeking comment from anyone connected to Judge Harrison. Monday morning, Elaine's phone rang nonstop. Former colleagues, community leaders, and even strangers called to express support. Some shared their own experiences in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Mrs. Carter, one caller said, my son appeared before Harrison 3 years ago. He talked to him just like he talked to that boy in your article. My son never recovered his confidence. Thank you for speaking out. Not all the calls were supportive. Some community members defended the judge, saying he was simply tough on crime. Others suggested Elaine had exaggerated or misunderstood what happened. At the courthouse, Judge Harrison continued his docket as if nothing had happened. When reporters approached him, he brushed past them without comment. But those who knew him well noticed he seemed tense, his normally commanding presence slightly diminished. By Wednesday, the story had reached the state capitol. 2 state representatives called for an investigation into Judge Harrison's conduct. The chief judge of the county court system issued a statement promising to look into these serious allegations. That afternoon, Elaine received an unexpected visitor. A man in a crisp suit knocked on her door, introducing himself as James Washington from the State Judicial Conduct Commission. "Mrs. Carter, we've received your formal complaint," he said, sitting in her living room. "Along with 17 others since that newspaper article ran, we're opening an official investigation." Elaine felt a wave of relief. "Will you be reviewing court transcripts?" "Yes," Mr. Washington confirmed. "And we'll be interviewing court staff, attorneys, and defendants who appeared before Judge Harrison. This is just the beginning of what could be a lengthy process." As Mr. Washington was leaving, Elaine's phone rang. It was Marcus's grandmother. "Mrs. Carter, something wonderful has happened," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice filled with emotion. "Marcus's public defender called. The district attorney is dismissing the shoplifting charge due to community service already performed. They're not even asking for probation." Elaine smiled. The article was already having effects. The district attorney's office was clearly doing damage control, not wanting to be associated with Judge Harrison's behavior. That evening, as Elaine prepared dinner, a news alert popped up on her phone. Judge Harrison had issued a statement denying any bias in his courtroom. He described himself as firm but fair and suggested the allegations were politically motivated. The statement ended with, "I have served this community with distinction for 15 years and will continue to do so, despite these baseless attacks on my character and professionalism." Elaine shook her head as she read. The judge still didn't get it. This wasn't about politics, it was about justice. Later that night, she called Tasha. "Did you see his statement?" "I did," Tasha replied. "But he's in for a surprise. I've been contacted by 3 former court clerks who worked in his courtroom. They're ready to talk, and they have stories that will shock everyone." Elaine put down her phone and looked out her kitchen window at the night sky. The wheel of justice turned slowly, but it was turning. The Hamilton County Courthouse stood like a stone giant in the center of town. Built in 1912, its marble columns and high dome had witnessed generations of justice and injustice. On Monday morning, the building bustled with unusual activity as members of the State Judicial Conduct Commission arrived to begin their formal investigation. Inside courtroom 7B, Judge Harrison presided as usual, but things were not normal. A representative from the commission sat quietly in the back row, taking notes on everything that happened. Court staff moved nervously, aware of the extra scrutiny. The judge himself seemed irritated, his rulings curt and his patience thin. Across town, Marcus Johnson returned to school with a new sense of purpose. The dismissal of his case had lifted a weight from his shoulders. His teachers noticed the change immediately. He raised his hand in class today. Mr. Peterson, his English teacher, told Principal Wong. First time since the incident. He even stayed after to ask about the essay assignment. Meanwhile, Elaine Carter sat in a small conference room at the offices of the Hamilton County Gazette. Tasha had arranged a meeting with 3 former court employees who had worked with Judge Harrison. Their stories proved even more troubling than Elaine had expected. He had nicknames for certain types of defendants, explained Sandra Miller, who had worked as a court clerk for 8 years. He called young black males frequent flyers, even if they had never been in court before. He turned off his microphone sometimes, added Thomas Reeves, a former bailiff. He'd make comments that wouldn't go on the official record, comments about defendants' appearances, their families, their neighborhoods. The third whistleblower, Patricia Ortiz, had been a Spanish interpreter in the court. "He rushed through cases with Hispanic defendants," she said quietly. "Once, he told me to just give them the highlights instead of a full translation of their rights. When I refused, he reported me to my supervisor." Tasha captured every word, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. This would be her follow-up story, even more explosive than the first. By Wednesday, the investigation had expanded. The commission interviewed dozens of attorneys who practiced regularly in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Most spoke cautiously, aware that they would still need to appear before him if he remained on the bench. But a few were bold, particularly those nearing retirement or planning to move to different jurisdictions. He set bail so high for certain defendants that they had no chance of getting out before trial. one public defender revealed. Then he used their time in detention against them during sentencing. On Thursday morning, Elaine received a call from James Washington at the commission. "Mrs. Carter, we need to speak with the young man from your initial complaint," he said. "I understand the need to protect his privacy as a minor, but his testimony could be crucial." Elaine hesitated. "He's been through enough already." "We can arrange for him to speak confidentially," Mr. Washington assured her. "No need for him to confront the judge directly." After discussing it with Marcus and his family, Elaine helped arrange the interview. Mrs. Johnson insisted on being present, sitting protectively beside her grandson as he recounted his experience to two commission members. Marcus spoke clearly and calmly, describing how Judge Harrison had mocked his clothes, his speech, and his future prospects. The details matched perfectly with what Elaine had reported. "How did it make you feel?" one investigator asked gently. Marcus looked down at his hands before answering. "Like I was nothing, like no matter what I did or how hard I worked, some people would only ever see me one way." Across town, Judge Harrison received a hand-delivered letter from the chief judge of the county court system. Effective immediately, he was being temporarily reassigned to administrative duties pending the outcome of the investigation. Another judge would take over his docket. As Harrison read the letter, his face flushed with anger. He crumpled the paper and threw it against the wall of his chambers. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, William Harrison was experiencing something new: accountability. That evening's news featured the headline, "Judge Harrison removed from courtroom duties amid misconducted investigation." The story that had begun with one boy's humiliation was now shaking the foundations of the local justice system. While the investigation into Judge Harrison continued, Marcus Johnson found himself on an unexpected new path. The weeks following his court appearance had changed him in ways no one could have predicted. It began with a simple invitation from Mrs. Carter. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she told Marcus one afternoon as they sat in his grandmother's living room. The next day, she introduced him to Anthony Dalton, a local attorney who had read about the case in the newspaper. Mr. Dalton specialized in civil rights law and had been fighting against injustice in the court system for over 20 years. "I started out just like you," Mr. Dalton told Marcus as they shook hands. "Young, black, and facing a system that didn't see my potential. Now I helped change that system." Marcus was quiet throughout their first meeting, mostly listening as Mr. Dalton and Mrs. Carter discussed the ongoing investigation. But as they were leaving, he asked his first question. "How did you become a lawyer when everything was against you?" Mr. Dalton smiled. "I found my voice, and once I found it, I never stopped using it." Those words stayed with Marcus. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about all the other kids who might have stood before Judge Harrison, feeling small and worthless. Kids who didn't have someone like Mrs. Carter to stand up for them. The next morning, Marcus approached Principal Wong before school started. "I want to join the debate team," he said firmly, "and I want to learn more about how the law works." Principal Wong was surprised but pleased. "That's great, Marcus. The debate team meets on Thursdays after school. As for learning about law," he thought for a moment, "we have a mock trial program that partners with the community college. I can get you information about that too." Within 2 weeks, Marcus had joined both programs. His natural intelligence and growing passion for justice made him a quick study. In debate, he learned to organize his thoughts and speak confidently. In mock trial, he began to understand how the legal system was supposed to work, and how it often failed. Mrs. Carter attended his first debate competition. She sat in the back of the room, watching as Marcus argued his assigned position with clarity and conviction. His voice, once quiet and hesitant, now filled the room. When he won third place, the pride on his face brought tears to her eyes. Meanwhile, Mr. Dalton had another idea. He ran a volunteer program at the Community Legal Aid Center where high school students could help with basic tasks while learning about the law. He offered Marcus a position. "We can't pay you," he explained, "but the experience will be valuable if you're serious about understanding how justice works and doesn't work." Marcus accepted immediately. Twice a week after school, he headed to the small office downtown where Mr. Dalton and his team provided free legal assistance to people who couldn't afford lawyers. Marcus started by filing paperwork and answering phones, but soon he was sitting in on client interviews, taking notes, and helping people fill out forms. He has a natural way with people, Mr. Dalton told Mrs. Carter during one of their regular check-ins. Clients trust him. They open up to him. At home, Mrs. Johnson noticed the changes in her grandson. The defeated boy who had come home from court that day was disappearing. In his place was a young man with purpose. He's always reading now, she told Mrs. Carter over tea. Law books, history books. Last night he was explaining to me how the Supreme Court works. My Marcus, teaching me. 6 weeks after joining the debate team, Marcus asked his coach if he could propose his own topic for the upcoming regional competition. The coach was surprised. Students usually worked with assigned topics, but agreed to hear his idea. I want to debate reform in juvenile justice, Marcus explained. How we can make the system fair for everyone, regardless of race or income. The coach studied him for a moment before nodding. It's a complex topic, Marcus. You'll need to research both sides thoroughly. I already started, Marcus replied, pulling a folder of articles and notes from his backpack. I think I'm ready to find my voice. That evening, as Marcus practiced his arguments in his bedroom mirror, the news broke that 3 more judges in neighboring counties were now under investigation for similar patterns of biased behavior. The ripple effect of what had started with one boy in one courtroom was spreading across the state. 3 months after the investigation began, the State Judicial Conduct Commission released its findings. The report was damning. After reviewing hundreds of court transcripts and interviewing dozens of witnesses, the commission found that Judge William Harrison had demonstrated a consistent pattern of bias, particularly against young Black and Hispanic defendants. The report landed on front pages across the state. News cameras crowded outside the courthouse as reporters delivered updates with the imposing building as their backdrop. Local and even national commentators discussed the findings and their implications for the justice system. On the morning the report was released, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his grandmother, watching the coverage on their small television. This is the result of your courage, Mrs. Johnson said, patting his hand. You and Mrs. Carter started all this. Marcus shook his head. We just spoke up. The system did the rest. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Without Elaine Carter's determination and Marcus's willingness to share his story, nothing would have changed. Judge Harrison would still be on the bench, treating other young people the way he had treated Marcus. Later that day, the chief judge of the county court system held a press conference. Standing at a podium in the courthouse lobby, she announced a series of reforms. The findings regarding Judge Harrison are deeply troubling, she stated, her expression serious. But they'd also present an opportunity for meaningful change. Effective immediately, we are implementing new training requirements for all judges in our system, focusing on bias recognition and cultural competency. She continued, outlining additional reforms. A new community oversight board with representatives from diverse neighborhoods. Regular review of sentencing data to identify potential patterns of bias, and a simplified complaint process for those who experienced unfair treatment in the courts. Finally, she concluded, I am announcing the creation of a youth advisory council that will meet regularly with court officials to ensure young voices are heard in our justice system. Across town at Westside High School, Marcus was called to Principal Wong's office during his afternoon math class. He walked down the hallway wondering if something was wrong. When he entered the office, he found Mrs. Carter waiting with the principal. Marcus, Principal Wong said with a smile, Mrs. Carter has some news for you. The chief judge just called me, Mrs. Carter explained. They want you to be a founding member of the new Youth Advisory Council. You would represent students from this district. Marcus stood speechless, his eyes wide with surprise. You don't have to decide right now, she added. It's a big responsibility. I don't need time, Marcus replied, his voice stronger than either adult had ever heard it. I want to do it. Someone needs to speak for kids who feel like they don't matter in that courthouse. That evening, as Marcus told his mother and grandmother about the opportunity, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was from Mr. Dalton. Turn on Channel 4 now. The family gathered around their television just in time to see Judge William Harrison stepping up to a podium outside the courthouse. His normally proud posture was diminished, his expression strained. Camera flashes illuminated his face as he began to speak. After much reflection, Harrison said, reading from a prepared statement, I have decided to resign from my position on the bench, effective immediately. The cameras captured the murmurs that rippled through the crowd of reporters. No one had expected resignation. Most legal experts had predicted a temporary suspension at worst. The investigation has brought to light aspects of my judicial conduct that, upon reflection, do not meet the standards our community deserves, Harrison continued. His voice, once so commanding in the courtroom, now sounded hollow. I apologize to those who were treated unfairly in my courtroom, particularly the young people who deserve better from our justice system. As the former judge stepped away from the podium, ignoring shouted questions from reporters, Marcus turned to his family. He didn't really change, Marcus said quietly. He just got caught. Maybe, his mother replied, putting her arm around his shoulders. But the system is changing because of what happened to you, and that's what really matters. That night, for the first time since his court appearance, Marcus slept without nightmares of Judge Harrison's mocking voice. 2 years passed quickly. On a bright spring morning, the auditorium of Westside High School buzzed with excitement. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, occupied by families dressed in their Sunday best. At the front, a stage had been decorated with blue and gold banners, the school colors, and a podium stood center stage, awaiting the day's speakers. Marcus Johnson sat in the front row, wearing a crisp white shirt and tie beneath his graduation gown. His cap rested on his lap as he listened to Principal Wong's opening remarks. In the audience behind him sat his mother, grandmother, and a special guest, Elaine Carter, who had become like family over the past 2 years. And now, Principal Wong announced, "It is my great honor to introduce our class valedictorian. This young man has maintained a perfect 4.0 GPA while serving on the Youth Advisory Council to the county court system, captaining our award-winning debate team, and earning a full scholarship to State University where he plans to study pre-law. Please welcome Marcus Johnson." The audience erupted in applause as Marcus rose from his seat. He adjusted his tie, a gift from Mr. Dalton, and walked confidently to the podium. Gone was the hesitant boy who once stood trembling before a judge. In his place stood a young man who had found his purpose and his voice. "Good morning," Marcus began, his clear voice carrying through the auditorium. 2 years ago, I stood in a different room, before a different audience. I was afraid. I was ashamed. I believed what someone in power wanted me to believe about myself, that I was nothing more than a statistic, another black boy headed for trouble. The audience grew quiet, hanging on his every word. That day could have been the end of my story. In many ways, for many young people who look like me, it is the end. One mistake, one harsh judgment, one adult who uses their power to crush rather than lift up. Marcus paused, looking out at the faces watching him. He saw his mother wiping tears from her eyes. He saw Mrs. Carter nodding encouragingly. But my story took a different turn because someone saw me, really saw me, and decided to stand up. Mrs. Elaine Carter, a retired principal with nothing to gain and potentially much to lose, spoke truth to power. She taught me that one person with courage can start a movement for change. He gestured toward Elaine in the audience, and people turned to look at her. Someone started clapping, and soon the entire auditorium joined in. Elaine blushed but sat up straighter, pride evident in her face. When the applause died down, Marcus continued, "The past 2 years have taught me something important. Systems don't change themselves. People change systems. Since that day in court, our county has implemented training for judges on recognizing bias. They've created a community oversight board with real power. They've established youth advisory councils in every courthouse. And 3 more judges in our state have been removed for similar patterns of biased behavior." He smiled slightly. "I'd like to say these changes happened because everyone suddenly realized there was a problem. But that's not how progress works. Change happened because people spoke up, because they gathered evidence, because they refused to accept the status quo." Marcus looked down at his notes, then set them aside. "To my fellow graduates, I have one message. Find your voice. Use it for those who cannot speak for themselves. Whether you become a doctor, a teacher, a mechanic, or yes, even a judge, remember that your voice matters." His eyes scanned the audience once more. 2 years ago, I was mocked by a judge who thought he knew my future. Today, I stand here to tell you that I will become a different kind of judge, one who sees the potential in every person who enters my courtroom, one who uses power to lift up rather than tear down. Marcus picked up his cap from the podium. Class of 2027, our stories are just beginning. Let's make them count. As he placed the cap on his head, the auditorium erupted in cheers and applause. Students and parents rose to their feet in a standing ovation. In the third row, Mrs. Carter dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Later, as families gathered on the lawn for pictures, a reporter from the Hamilton County Gazette approached Marcus. "Congratulations on your speech," she said. "I have one question. What would you say to Judge Harrison if you could speak to him today?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering. "I'd thank him," he said finally. "Not for what he did, but for what his actions revealed. A broken system that needed fixing. Sometimes it takes being broken to find your strength. I found mine, and I hope he found his."